There we
Okay, I
go.
did a little question, so that
Great.
was great.
Thank you to those of you who shared. I'm now going to go back to sharing my screen. All right. Everyone can see that okay? Wonderful.
Yes.
I am so very honored and excited to kick off the first of our live webinar series for teaching African American history, the first ever time that National History Day has offered this webinar series. As many of you know, and you have read from the assignments, this follows one of our most recent publications, Because of the Color of Our Skin, 400 Years of African American History. So we're so pleased to be able to offer both those resources in print and digitally for teachers, along with this webinar series. So welcome to all of you who are able to join us tonight, and those of you who will be watching the recording later. I would also like to thank our generous sponsors who make education and resources like this possible to such a wide group of teachers and educators from across the country. We thank the 400 Years of African American History Commission, along with the Bezos Family Foundation. Tonight, and I will allow you to introduce yourselves as you are giving your own particular pieces of this webinar. We have Dr. Tara White with us, and we have Dr. Renee Romano with us, both of whom contributed really incredible articles that you have read in this last module to the resource I mentioned and showed 400 Years of African American History. So we are so excited to have you in the digital flesh with us to expand more on the really important resource article that you shared with us in the text. Um, Along with my colleague, Jamie Hollifield, she and I are the two representatives from National History Day, where we both serve as program managers there. So it is our job and our delight to bring resources like this to you all. A few nuts and bolts for our time together this evening. You will communicate with the presenters, so Jamie and I, using a Q&A box. Because we work with students and minors, we don't have video and open chat for all participants on our webinars. So any questions, any comments you have, you will use that Q&A box, and you will also submit questions there at near the end of tonight's webinar when we have an open Q&A session. You will also have a QR code and a link that will take you to a survey. Completing that survey is required for getting your attendance marked off for this webinar. So either you will be doing that live at the end or you will be doing it at the end of the recording that you watch. Tomorrow morning, you will have a PDF of the slides and the recording available in Google Classroom under Webinar 1 Materials. You can expect that by mid-morning, and I will make a Google announcement saying that everything has taken its time on the back end and is uploaded successfully, and it is now available for you to review. Finally, the next module, Module 2, will be available to you all this Friday, January 10th. But be on the lookout that it might be a little bit early. Okay, so with that, I am going to end my screen share and invite Dr. White to share yours. And Dr. White, you are still muted.
I got it right. Okay, all righty. So it is really good to be here with everyone. Good evening. I'm Tara White. I am a professor at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, where I teach African American history, U.S. history, public history, Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I am really pleased to be here, and I am I'm thrilled to be talking to educators. I feel that my life has done today a 360 because I started out in history, in education and public programs, and the wonderful Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And so 30 years ago, right? 30 something years ago. So it's really good to be back with teachers and talking about African American history. So what I want to do before we get started, and I want to do this because I know that the theme for this year for National History Day is rights and responsibilities in history. And I thought looking at African American history through the lens of citizenship, right? What does it mean to be a citizen, right? What is citizenship? Questions such as, what are the rights of citizens of the United States? Then, what are the challenges to citizenship rights did African Americans face over the course of American history? And then, thinking about how the definition of citizenship has changed over the course of American history, right? I think those are, for those of us who teach U.S. history, right? Those are some of the things that are a huge part of that course. And particularly for African American history, as you're thinking about, what citizenship is and who are citizens and what are their rights, I think this is really appropriate. And I think it really will work for us this year's theme. Of course, I want to be able to introduce K-12 educators to digital repositories and primary source materials, because I think it's important for us to get students to thinking about not just so many times they, see the textbook, right? And what someone else has written about what historians think or have said or whatever. And I think it's important for them to actually look at some of the sources that we use as historians to develop those interpretations and those narratives and whatever. So I want to introduce us to, the vast number of digital repositories that hold these primary sources. I want us to also review some of the major themes in African American history, and we'll do that as we go, right? We will discuss historical thinking and the use of historical thinking skills to help students analyze these sources and to kind of ask some questions of some of these things that we're going to see this evening. And then finally, we would like to, or I would like for us to demonstrate, or for me to demonstrate a few kind of active learning strategies to use for teaching African American history using these sources. And so we're going to be rocking and rolling today, and I'm going to be zipping through. So if you have questions, write those questions down, hold them, and we'll get back to them. I promise. All right. So I wanted to start out with this quote by Nathan Huggins. Nathan Huggins was a historian, African-American historian who was very active in the 70s and 80s, really, mostly 70s and 80s. And he died very young, died of cancer very young. But this quote always, I use this a lot because I think it's very important. And it's that African American history is American history. Now, that's my contribution. His contribution is this. And he says one of the most important reasons for studying Afro-American history, and you see Afro-American history, right? A little bit dated, but he's dead. So, one of the most important reasons for studying Afro-American history is that through it, we may come to a better understanding of American history, right? And so in many places in American history, African-American history really kind of is a reflection, or it allows us to reflect on, some of those tensions that we see in American history, right? It allows us to reflect on the ideas and ideals of American history, right? And it allows us to understand those places where, of course, America had not lived up to its own ideals, right? And its own standards. But also, because I've done civil rights history for a very long time, it also allows us to see those places where the promise is made. And in many cases, African Americans are going back to those promises time and time and time again, right? And they are demanding, as King talked about in his I Have a Dream speech. He talked about a blank check, right? That America wrote, and that there is a blank check, that the ideas of about freedom, ideas about democracy, ideas about liberty, right? Those are all things to be fulfilled, right? And he saw his, in many ways, he saw his work as actually asking America to actually, pay the check, right? I'm presenting the check. I want you to pay the check. In the same way, Nathan Huggins also saw American history and African American history. And keeping with, as we think about historical thinking, I want us to, I think it's important for us to kind of help students see the ways that historians think about history and the way that historians use these sources to analyze and interpret history, right? More than anything, I always tell my students, history starts with a question, always, right? And historians start with questions, right? And they ask questions and then they make claims to answer those questions, right? And they use evidences to support those claims. And so these narratives and histories you see are historians making claims about the past and using evidences, both primary and secondary sources, to respond to those and to answer those questions, right? Using the claims they make and the evidences they've assembled. And so I would like for us to consider historical thinking and look at them as the 6 C's, right? Easy to remember, right? And this isn't terrorist. I cannot say this is wonderful. This was a wonderful series of articles from the American Historical Review. So just know that, right? So these 6 C's are things that you've seen before: change over time, continuity, context, causality, contingency, and complexity, right? And because I want people to, and I want students to understand, how complex, right, history is. One of the things that I like to employ here is that multiple accounts and perspectives, right? Because I think it's important for students to be able to see a variety of accounts and how they, work in creating a narrative, but also the connection between claims and those evidences, right, that we use to support those claims. Okay. And so I'm going to, again, the entire time, I will be whizzing through because it's a whole lot of stuff. But I want you to keep those questions, write them down, but I will be looking at, big points and major themes, and in some of these places, really kind of explicating in the various ways how we can use those ways of thinking. Okay, so just follow me, I promise I'm taking you somewhere. All right, so I thought it was important, and I always think it's important with African American history to start with the West African past. It's important for people to know that, African people don't arrive as a blank slate, that they came from somewhere, right? And they came from somewhere with a distinct, with their own histories, right? And so it's important for us, as you're doing this, to make sure to stress the diversity of the African continent, right? Africa is a continent, not a country. Huge landmass, enough to put in the US and China and Russia and a whole bunch of countries, but also that Africa today, the continent, contains 54 countries, okay? 54 countries. And I think that's important for me to actually say out loud. The other thing that is important is that, all of these various places that have cultures that have changed over time, through movement, through migration, through, the political changes, changes in boundaries, all the same kinds of things that happen in other countries, right? You see a variety of cultures, a variety of languages, religions, social structures, political systems, and histories. And it's important for us to make that clear, right, to students, that students see this as a very, very vast and diverse place. That, it's also important for us to understand that there was no Pan-African identity until late 19th century, this notion that Africans are one big group of people or whatever, they didn't think of themselves that way, right? And as we encounter, the slave trade, Africans and Europeans, Europeans are not just stumbling upon the continent. They've been trading with Africans for centuries before then, right? And it's important for us to understand that various European countries had long trade histories, right? And long histories trading as peers with these people, right? And peoples primarily along the northern and western coast, some on the southern and eastern coast. But I also want to speak to, one of the things we hear is that those people, Africans traded their own people. No, that's not really, that's ahistorical, right? If we're thinking about the French and the English at certain points in history, if slave trading was happening on the continent of Europe, the French would have gladly given up the English, right? They would have gladly traded the English and vice versa, right? And so, because well, those of us who taught Western Civ, and European history, we know that there was no love lost for a long time. So it's important for us to see and think of it in that same way. You're talking about different peoples, different histories, different languages, different cultures, right? And to this culture or these cultures, just like any other, family and community groups are important, right? Family is the center of African life, just like it was in every other people group across the world. And slave trading, when we get to actually the 16th, 17th century, and people are starting to think about those, starting up, it's important for us to understand that slave trading is really we're talking about power and influence, right? And power and influence within the African continent, over, various countries and cultural lines, right? But so it's not just about economic gain, right, for these nations that are involved with this. This is also about shaping the political power and political influence internally, right? And of course, economic gain from some of their trading partners. Slave trading was a complex economic enterprise, and the whole notion of the transatlantic slave trade, and this is something that I want to remind us, and something that should not get lost in this, is the humanity of those Africans that are being traded and enslaved, right? Because what they leave families, they leave parents, they leave sisters, they leave brothers, they leave children, and so forth and so on, right? And so they leave an entire life, an entire world, right? And they're taken to a place that's completely foreign and a very in a very strict and very different system. Okay. when we talk about the West African past, it's important for us to pull in the voices of those folks who are on the scene, right? And so people from a variety of West African cultures talked about their lives before they came to North America. And it's important for us to use their own language and their own voices, right? To talk about their experiences with their families, in their communities, in their cultural groups, and so forth and so on, right? That is important. It's important to actually use their own language and their own voices. And so I pulled Olaudah Equiano as one of those examples, but he's not the only example. There are other examples that you can pull. Most of us are familiar with the Amistad case, and it is we can actually pull some of the interviews and the testimonies of those folks who talked about their lives before they were taken captive and then brought to North America. So, in the various places where you're doing and you're talking with your students about aspects of African American history, you do want to think about these people's use their own voices, use their own words, and let their words speak for them. The other thing is one of those historical thinking ways of thinking. We do want to think about using this as context, right? As we're laying the backstory so that students understand the fuller story, that this is one of those places where you do want to use context, right? Because once all of these various groups, and guys, keep in mind, you got all of these folks coming from all of these different cultures, right? Different cultures, different countries, and they come together and they are really creating, right, what we know as African America or African Americans, what we now know as African Americans. I love the way Neil Painter uses that, right? These folks are coming together, and what we now know as African Americans, right? A variety of cultures, a variety of languages, a variety of peoples, right? Created that. And so that syncretism and that actual confluence of a whole lot of cultures is what you have. And the context of that, right, is important, right? Maps are a great way, and I don't have the maps here, but I do want to encourage you to think about getting students to understand, the transatlantic slave trade is not just coming to North America, right? There are a variety of places these boats stopped. And so you want to try to use these maps as a way to actually show students where the boats stopped, right? And where so many of these people ended up. This particular map, and I should have pulled it up, would have been good, that details the volume and direction of the transatlantic slave trade from all of African to all of American, North American regions, right? North and South American regions. You will do yourself really good to use that, because students can actually see how many people are getting off at various places, and they can see things like, most students don't realize that South America, so many people went to South America, right? Most folks don't really get that. And so to give them a sense of what the entire trade was, maps are very useful. And the introduction to North America here with John Rolfe, this letter about those 20 or so odd Negroes, right? That come and just end up here. This is not even on purpose. It just happened that way. But it was transformative, right? Accidents, transformative. And so the letter where Rolfe is writing to Edwin Sandy, he's kind of describing what's going on, doing a report actually of what's happening in the colony or whatever. That is important. And the image of the Brooks slave ship, right? That is also important. And the knowledge that, this is really about trying to show what the physical space is in a slave ship, but also, what the experiences of those people were probably were, right? When they were being transported here. And so as we, for colonial and revolutionary America, my key points are these. You want to be able to note the changes in the nature of enslavement. I'm going to pull my screen up a little bit. That enslavement is not, the same. And if we're thinking about things like change over time, right? And concepts like change over time, enslavement is not the same from 1619 when those 20 or so odd Negroes landed to the middle of the 19th century. Not the same. What you have is a transformation from like quasi-indenture to durante vita, right? Durante vita, which means for the rest of your natural life or the course of your natural life, right? Your entire life. These laws were used, right, to change and to transform slavery into the thing that we came to know by the mid 19th century, right? And laws were also used to reinforce racial hierarchies. Again, one thing I really want people to understand is that the notion of race, right? And we talk about race with slavery because slavery becomes racialized slavery, right? And that's important for us to understand. And the notion of race and racial hierarchies start and are reinforced through laws during the enslavement. And so that's important for us to know. And the importance of as these folks are coming in and like I said, as slavery is changing, right? The importance of creating family and community and institutions, especially for those folks who don't remain enslaved because of this quasi-indenture kind of squishy. I know I'm using little kid terms. I was with nieces and nephews during the break, so yes, little bitty people. So squishy squashy, kind of racial, lines, right? There are folks who don't remain enslaved and they end up forming the core of these free Black communities that we see pop up in places like New York and in Philadelphia and in Boston and in Connecticut and Rhode Island and all of these other places, right, in colonial America. And so it's important for us to be able to speak to those experiences as well, because the totality of African American experience during the colonial revolutionary period, it's not enslavement, right? There are free Black communities. These folks create communities and institutions, right? And organizations. And those are going to be important in this as they are disputing, right? Freedom, right? As they are discussing the limits and the bounds of their freedom, as they are negotiating, right? What their rights should be, right? And later on, the rights of those folks who are enslaved, okay? And so that's important for us to remember. That the revolution, and it's important for us to also, another big point is that the revolution presents a conflict, right? A conflict between, that whole talk of freedom, right? And liberty, right? In a nation of slavery, in a nation that enslaves people. And that, really what we see coming out of the revolution is free and unfree, right? Freedom and unfreedom. And that it is speaking of that mirror, enslavement provides a way for people to talk about what freedom ain't. To use my good Alabama English. What freedom is not, right? And so that is something that I want you to think about as you are teaching this part of the and talking about African Americans during this period. And that the other thing that's important is that African Americans face real prejudice, right? These free Blacks in colonial and early America face real prejudice as they are setting out to create family and community and institutions. And we see some of these institutions actually emerge out of this real prejudice. The churches, right? Some of the schools. We see, various organizations, right? And I've included just a little bit of picture of revolutionary soldiers here and African Americans who were a part of that, the patriots in the American Revolution, but also Prince Hall, right? The American African American version of the Masonic Order or African American Masonic Order that had to go out around England and out of America and over to Europe to actually create their own Masonic Order because they were not allowed in the Masonic Order here. And so you have these various things. I'm going to show you Madam Phyllis there, right? Who is starting to write about this time. And so the other big thing I want and I want you to think about as, again, community, family, community, institution, is that folks are starting to write not just about their experiences, but then you have some other folks who are doing some what humans do. Humans like poetry. Human beings like literature. Human beings like to communicate and to express themselves and so forth. And so you'll see that is important for us to note. And then finally, the abolitionist movement, because again, in this vast freedom, you have so much bondage, right? Yep.
Dr. White, I know that there's so much to go through. So I'm giving you like a 9-minute warning as opposed to a 5-minute warning, but I'll be back again at the 5-minute mark.
That'll work.
Great.
All right. And so early antebellum America, I want you to, I want you to think about, as we're talking about citizenship, the elusive nature of full freedom and full equality, full citizenship rights. And what is important here is something, Dred Scott versus Sanford is really important, because what it does is it causes doubts that, these folks would ever be fully free in America, right? And Judge Roger Taney expresses that very clearly. The other thing I want us to think about is voting rights, because people don't, even in places where you have free Blacks like North Carolina, you don't have folks who are able to vote. Free Black communities, not enslaved, got a lot of money, can't vote, right? Okay. Some of the people you want to take a look at to kind of illustrate some of those claims. Reverend Allen started the AME Church, right? These other institutions. Francis Harper is talking about voting and citizenship for a long time, right? Context, change over time, and the continuity of the conversation about liberty and equality, right? Okay. Documents, I'm moving, I promise I'm moving. And so by the time we get to the Civil War, please don't tell, anyways, I'm not going to go into that whole speech. But as we're finished the Civil War and Reconstruction, you want to use again, change over time. I gave that example about places like North Carolina, Virginia, so forth, where people were free, but could not vote, right? And so the 14th Amendment, right, which citizenship, birthright citizenship, equal protection, equal equal rights before, equal protection under, but also the expansion of due process. That is important, right? And then, of course, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed people the right to vote. Those are important in the face of that change, right? But you want to make sure that they understood, that your students understand what freedom means, right? It's one thing to have, be enslaved, not have any control over your body. You don't own it. Your children, you don't own them. Your life, you don't own it, right? Your life and destiny, none of that is your own. And to go from that to freedom over your lives, your bodies, your destinies, right? And the ability to form permanent families, right? Those are important, right? And finally, to have a say in politics, okay? People, Tubman, Smalls, Turner, and wonderful documents, wonderful ways of seeing and hearing them talk about what this means and how their lives have been transformed because they had previously been enslaved, what it meant to be a free person, and having a say over the way that you would be represented and whatever, right? So context definitely change over time. You can see the change in citizenship status, and then contingency, because we assume that, Reconstruction was a wonderful, Du Bois said, wonderful, place in the light for a little bit, right? And so that contingency, because what if Reconstruction had lasted, right? What if it had not been overthrown by violence, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we want to think about. I dare not wade into this. This is by period, by favor. You see the slide is thick. But anyways, I do want us to understand, during Reconstruction, what is also powerful is these Black and white alliances, right? And we see those again during populism, right? Those Black-white political alliances. And those are important to note. It's also important to note that although progressivism is tremendously democratic, right? That there's also this really anti-democratic arm, right? And Black reformers are fighting it the whole time, right? You have women, and this is where I use the colored women's clubs and people like Ida B. Wells and so forth to do this. Talk about the laws, how the laws codify, right, and define segregation, disfranchisement. Douglass is a wonderful person. And again, talk about that continuity, because Douglass is still saying the same stuff. He doesn't change. And then finally, the leadership vacuum allows Booker T. Washington, once Douglass dies in 1895, allows Washington to step in and again, continue to help people, organize institutions. But institution creation and reconstruction that continue during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era is something that's really important to note. And this interracial organization, people assume that the NAACP is just Black people. No, NAACP was very, very interracial group, very diverse group is what I want to say. And it's important for us to make that case. And these are some of the folks you want to talk about. Again, yeah, contingency there as well. So
this is the 5-minute warning.
Okay, this is my 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to spend because most people most people know the civil rights movement pretty well. I'm going to spend my last few here, and then I'm just going to tick through, right? World Wars I and II were opportunities for African Americans to show that they, were, in it to win it, right? And they wanted to be a part of the, fully American, right? As opposed to half American, as the guy who wrote the letter for and suggested Double V expressed. They expected full citizenship after each sacrifice, and they didn't get it either time. But The first time they come back, there's this huge response to all these Black guys coming back in uniform, right? At the same time, you have the start of the Great Migration, people moving out of the South because there's just crazy violence. And this violence is continuing. But also people are looking for other opportunities to educate their children, live better, so forth and so on. The thing that I want you to think about here with not just the widespread violence and the movement of people, right? I want us to think about this as a game changer, right? The Great Migration is a game changer politically, right? Because it allows a whole lot of Black folks to leave the South and enough to actually for them to actually be politically viable again, right? And to have to actually play a part politically, and that is important as we think about those. And then, of course, the Double V campaign, like I said, this whole half American thing, right? Am I going to be half American again? Am I expected to do that? But the impact of the Holocaust on Black soldiers should not be downplayed. So many Black soldiers actually were a part of these liberations in various parts of Europe, and they saw those bodies stacked up like cordwood. Now imagine having experienced lynching in your society and go to a place that based their rules on your society. You are, it is not a hard sale to think that, wait a minute, this could be us, right? And so Black soldiers are bound and determined to come back and to change the world, and they do. So many of those Black soldiers are part of the civil rights movement. I have this picture of Mary McLeod Bethune, one of my favorite people, somebody I'm actually writing about because I think it's important for us to understand the power of Black women in these movements that Black women were very much a part of, not just suffrage, not just the progressive era reform, but also in these conversations about changing America. And Bethune symbolizes, women from the NAACP, because several Black women were part of the founding of that. But the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs that I study, and also the National Council of Negro Women. And so context, continuity, causality, right, are important, because although the suffrage movement allows some women to vote, not all women are voting, right? And so they have it's another reason for them to be involved. And so I'm going to, I'm gonna kind of stop it right there. If you have any questions, hold on to those questions, and we can definitely come back to it, because I'm here for it. I'm here for it. Key points, people. Yeah. And
Thank you so much, Dr. White. We will have some time at the end of our session today for folks to ask questions of you, both on things that you presented, but also on your articles that they have read. So they're aware of your scholarship about Black club women.
All right.
Yeah. Yes. So thank you. With that, we're going to turn things over to Dr. Romano, who's going to talk about your wonderful resources within this text and other videos that we have available online on the NHG website about why and how to be careful about terminology.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Can everybody see this?
We see
the right
just
screen?
a piece of it.
Okay, so let me stop share and see.
Let's try it again.
Yeah, let's try it again. Let me close that one. Sorry, I don't want to waste time on this, but let's try that.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. I'm just going to speak really briefly. I'm Renee Romano. I teach history and museum studies, and I specialize in histories of race, histories of sexuality, which means that the issue that I'm going to briefly talk about with you today is one that I come across all the time, and then I think you are going to, if you haven't already, you will come across with your students, and that is issues of terminology. And when you're talking about African American history, but not only African American history, many fields of history, you're going to arise finding that many times we come across sources or terminology in our sources that are outdated or are patently offensive, right? And I have two big sort of points I want to make tonight with you. One is that how to think about and what kind of terminology to use in their own writing for students is often a huge gray area. It's really confusing, I think, for many students about what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what terms to use. And so you're going to want to think about strategies to offer them guidance. They're really going to need guidance about how to be respectful in their writing while being true to the past. The second area that the big point I want to make is that I think issues of terminology and language are enormous pedagogical opportunities. There are so many things that we can teach students when we pay attention to language. So thinking about terminology, what can we teach with that? One, we can teach that language itself is a historical source, right? Looking at the rhetoric, the terms people used is a window into how they thought, can be a window into human consciousness, certainly is a window into what people experienced, right? So we don't want to ignore, run away from, pretend, right? We see a term we consider ugly. We don't, I don't see that anymore, right? That we are historians. We want to understand the past, and that means understanding the language that people used and why they used it. A second thing you can learn through terminology in a study is that language has its own history, right? That it changes over time. We started this, Dr. White started her presentation with the Nathan Huggins quote and then said, oh, that term Afro-American, that's outdated, right? That's not an offensive term per se, but it is an outdated term. If you use that term, it will seem like, not quite right, right? And what that means for students is many things that they may come across a term that they don't even know because it's outdated and they don't hear it anymore. They may need to know terms that they're not aware of in order to do good searches in primary sources. My very first scholarly work was on interracial marriage. And it took me a while to realize that if you're talking about interracial marriage in the 1920s, you need to look under things like amalgamation, miscegenation, terms that are now outdated, but that were the ways things were categorized and talked about in the past. And then a third thing to really consider teaching students or to use terminology to teach students is that language has power. And this is true historically, and it's true today, right? Language can be used to stigmatize, to degrade, to define who belongs and who doesn't belong. And it has the power to offend and to hurt. And so when we think about language has power, another pedagogical thing we need to be thinking about with our students is about communication. How do you communicate for a public audience? What's appropriate in different kinds of communication forms? So when they are writing, they need to be thinking about what power that their own words have and how that might affect the people who will be reading their work. So just really quickly, going to go through some of these very, very quickly. And this is in my article in the book, so I don't want to go into too much. But just some of the kinds of terms that are now considered outdated and their preferred terms today. What makes a term outdated? Usually it's that the group to which it is being referenced has decided that it does not feel respectful to them to be referred to in that way. And so we try as historians to follow what the desires of particular groups and how they want to be talked about, the words they want to use to describe themselves. So if a group is saying I'm not Oriental, that is offensive to me, we respect that and we say we're not going to use that term. We're going to use the term that people prefer today. And some of these have their own really interesting histories, like a term like Caucasian, you may still see on government forms, right? But that term, right, was created as a part of a process of racial superiority, right? And was made up by a guy who was a white supremacist, a racial scientist who basically thought that people from Caucasia were the most beautiful people in the world, so we'd name white people after them, right? It's a ridiculous term. And the fact that it's still around today is really something that, needs to be talked about as well. So some rules of thumb very quickly, and this is true for both outdated terms and slurs. You avoid using them in your own writing when you're using your own voice. You might quote them in a historical source, but not use them in your own voice. And if you're going to use them to better understand the historical context of the time, you might put them in quotation marks, like in this sentence. Right, before 1967, many states had anti-miscegenation laws, right? Now, one ways this gets really, really dicey and confusing for students, though, is that there are exceptions and that organizations that were founded, let's say in 1909 or 1912, or whenever they were founded, may well have used a term that is now considered outdated in their own organizational name. And so a student might wonder, can I say National Association for the Advancement of Colored People? I thought colored is sort of an outdated term. And it's like, unless that group wants to change their name, it is perfectly acceptable in their own name to do that. But it is dicey. Like my favorite example is something like the Colored Conventions, the political movement that is still called that. African Americans organizing 1830s through the 70s in the Colored Conventions. We use that term, but we wouldn't say colored people met at colored conventions. Say African American people met at colored conventions. Students aren't necessarily going to know that, so it's up to us to help them understand. This isn't outdated per se, but it's a sense of how language changes, that right now language is changing so that historians really prefer people first language. So an enslaved person instead of a slave, where you're not defining a person by a particular characteristic. And I just want to briefly, because I know we're running out of time and I do want to give time for questions, talk about racial slurs, because this is really one of the most challenging issues. People get in trouble for even having students read this in a historical source potentially. But again, I feel like we cannot run away from the way the past was. We need to be able to be respectful and really analyze the past. So slurs are terms that are derogatory, that were meant to stigmatize, were meant to hurt, were never considered respectful, were always considered insulting, right? And students may find these slurs in all kinds of primary sources because that's the way America is and was, right? So they might find it in an editorial cartoon, right? A very famous cartoon that you'll see recreated all the time. But if you read these notices, you'll see racial slurs in these notices. They might find an advertisement like this for Coon Chicken Inn, which was a famous restaurant chain in the West Coast. So your students might come across racial slurs not only in doing research on, let's say, African American history, but let's say they're doing research on history of restaurants, right? They need to be thinking, and you need to be sort of thinking about how to help them when they come across those kinds of languages. And same kinds of guidelines for slurs, except for, I think, it is never okay to use a racial slur when you're writing in your own voice. Many historians will paraphrase rather than quoting an offensive term directly, and will explain that an author used derogatory language. You will only want to quote the primary source directly if it is absolutely necessary to convey the meaning of that source and you're making a point about the language in that source, right? And if you do so, you really want a footnote to acknowledge that you know it's offensive. And I would say, because I judged documentaries last year, same thing for a documentary. If the students are quoting a clip that has racial slurs, they want to put somewhere in there some recognition that they understand that the language is offensive. And they're doing that both to be respectful to the past, but because they need to be respectful to their audiences in the present day. And they do not want a judge to say, this student made me mad because they used a term I find offensive. We want to know those students knew what they were doing, made that choice consciously, and made it for a good scholarly reason if they're using that language. So I'm going to stop there, and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so very much. What strikes me about what both of you are sharing, the such important wealth of knowledge that we don't even have the time to cover in one single webinar, is the important work that you're both doing as historians and the ways in which you're able to translate that work, your professional work, so that it has important bearing on what all of us are doing in the classroom. That translation work is not easy. I know that. Translating the work of professional historians to how do we get down to the discrete parts of this that can really change the way that students learn, students critically analyze, not just in our own classrooms, but in the wider world. So I thank you for sharing your expertise and time and care with us. What I'm going to do is, again, share my screen. Sorry. Here we go. So everyone is going to get this PDF. So you will have the contact information of our wonderful speakers if you have explicit questions that you would like to follow up on. Again, one more moment before we get to the Q&A. A thank you to our sponsors for making sure that we have the time and the space to have these really important conversations. So use that Q&A box and ask us what questions you have. I will say, as those of you are writing in the Q&A box to share what questions you have for Dr. Romano and Dr. White, this is a QR code and a link to the survey that you need to complete. This is for your attendance credit, which is required for you to have that signed off for this course. So, Jamie, do we have any questions that are coming in the Q&A box?
Yep, we just got one question.
Great.
If there are racial words in a novel that you're reading, how do you suggest that teachers handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to hear Dr. White's take on that too. I think you want to you want to open before you even start reading the novel. I think you want to have a conversation in class about terminology, about the language you're going to find, about why that author may have used that language and what it represents about the time, and then make some ground rules as a class about how you treat that language. Do you want to say it out loud in class or not, right? But I think to really teach students that this is something we can analyze and we need to understand. But if there are students for whom it's going to make them feel uncomfortable if those words are said aloud in class, then I think you can say, if we're reading a passage here, we leave it, we leave out that word, because the comfort of the students is really important. But also it's important to have a conversation about why that language is there and what it means.
I agree. Wholeheartedly. Change over time. I mean, language, I think we don't always think about the fact that language changes over time, right? Just like anything else in history. And so it's important for us to express that and help students to understand that, but also, as you were saying, be mindful for the present audience, right?
Yes.
And that those students who are present in that classroom are not made to feel uncomfortable. And so you develop your own strategy, Yeah.
All right. So our next question is for Dr. White. This participant said, while reading your article, I considered the strategic tensions between radical and moderate activism and whether these approaches can complement one another or create conflict. So, for example, reinforcing class divides or excluding marginalized voices within Black communities. What does history tell us about whether respectability politics can coexist with more radical approaches to racial justice, or are they just inherently at odds?
I think I love those club women. Yeah, but they're respectable as heck. I think it's important for us to, again, the context of the time, right? And the context of the time is where you have people who are saying that, African Americans are dot, 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 right? And, these folks believe that they have to show the world that they are something completely different. I mean, as the NACW created their organization, that really is front of mind for them, right? Front and center. They want to be able to show, they want to be able to prove that they, and of course, this is so, progressive. They want to be able to prove using evidence that they are dot, 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 right? That Black people are progressing, that Black people are not retreating into barbarism and so forth. Again, but they're speaking to the debates that are happening then, right? And I think it's important for us to know that there is no one way. Now, if you had you caught me when I was much younger, and think about this, I'm from Alabama, right? And so Booker T. Washington is people love Washington in Alabama. So, I was as a young person, really Du Boisian, right? I was a huge Du Bois fan, and I still am. I still am. But I understand strategy, right? And those people understood strategy. Washington understood that if he had the same way of doing things that Du Bois did, they would have burned his school down a long time ago, right? Tuskegee would not be, Tuskegee University. And so he understood that. He understood where he was and what he had to do to make it work. At the same time, that is not the only strategy. And so it did take the Ida B. Wellses, right? The William Monroe Trotters. It took those folks as well, right? To make this thing work. And so I would say older, wiser me would say that it took all of those strategies to actually help African American communities to especially when it came to, because they were looking at having they were sitting at the beginning of a disfranchisement campaign where they were losing their rights quickly, right? And so I think it's important for us to understand the context. I think it's important for us to know that all of those things work. And this is another opportunity where multiple accounts of perspectives, right? If we're thinking about historical thinking, you use the stuff from Ida B. Wells, you use some of the things from Margaret Murray or some of the other club women, and you use them to show, or Mary Church Terrell for that matter, and you use them to show that all there were places where all those people met, right? The Venn diagram. There were places where they all met up, but they had different approaches to the world, and that was, but that was what it took, right? And it was important for us. It's important for us to understand that.
We have a wonderful queue of questions, but I also want to acknowledge that it's just past 8 p.m. So for those of you who need to hustle off to other parts of your life, you are welcome to click that link or scan the QR code and make your way to what comes next in your lives. For those of you who are able to hang around, I think we have a queue of a good handful of questions, and in the time that's left with us, I hope we can get through some of them.
All right, so this next question is for Dr. White. What is the biggest misconception that your students have about African American history that you would like to see corrected?
So it depends on where you start. For some of the undergraduate students, I would say the biggest misperception is that African American history is like anti-white, quote unquote, anti-white history, right? And just where Black people are mad at white people. I don't know where that. I don't know. But anyways, I have no clue, I promise you. And so getting people to understand that, no, this is really about, a more complete picture and more complete story, right? That's one big misperception. And I see that, like I said, undergraduates. Graduate students, on the other hand, getting graduate students to understand that there is a historiography, right? And that this is not because when we talk about social history, and the histories from the bottom up that come from the 1960s that are inspired by the 1960s and 70s, right? It is, I think they believe that somebody just said, well, you're going to have to include our history too, and pull some things out of the air. I don't know where the heck you get them, but pull some stuff together and do it. as opposed to, understanding that there has, a historiography had been developing over the course of, right, the 19th, 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries, and that African American historians by the 60s and 70s, right, you have historians who have been writing for a while, and professional historians, mind you, and these folks are able to bring to bear, right, that scholarship that had been developing. So by the 60s and 70s, although, there is that call for African American history as a part of the, cultural renaissances you see out of the Black Power movement, right? You also have a historiography that is forming and shaping that they can actually that's there. Carter Woodson and all of his lieutenants over the years were developing. And so those are really my two big places that, it's really, anti-white people, more polemical. And then the other is that, there really isn't a historiography, and there is. Hopefully that answers the question.
Krista, can you throw the Jot form link in the chat? Somebody just asked to see if they could have access to it. They're having some issues accessing the link.
I may have to stop my screen share because I'm just working on my laptop, but yes.
So the next question actually is some suggestions on strategies. So I think this question is for the entire panel. Do you have any suggestions or specific stories or examples of effective and successful conversations that you've had with young students about these specific topics?
I think one of the moments, a real teaching moment in my class, I was teaching an African American history class, and one of the white students in the class said something about how we are protected by the police. And some Black students in the class went like, whoa, Nellie, like what? And so we, I said, let's stop everybody and let's look at our terms. What do we mean by we, right? Like who's the we in the we, and why might some people not consider themselves part of that we, right? So I think one of the things I have found as an educator in my own class is that if there is a term that is used that is problematic, if the instructor does not step in, the students will feel it and not feel and will feel abandoned or not protected or not seen. And so as hard as, and it's not always easy to do, but I think it's really imperative as a strategy that if there is something said that feels not quite to step in and say, okay, let's talk about what just happened here, because I think there's maybe some difference of opinion or whatever that is. So that's one sort of strategy I would put out there. There's so many, but it's just one thing. Yeah.
Add to that, there was a really wonderful piece of advice that was given to me early on in my teaching career, which is that sometimes in the moment when those moments happen in our classrooms, we don't necessarily have the wherewithal to say the things that we really want to be able to say. So knowing that you can come back to a classroom setting over the weekend or a week later and to say to your students, you know what? I don't like the way that I reacted. I really gave this a lot of time and thought. And here's what I would have said, or here's what I wish I would have said. Let's talk this through. And modeling being able to address an error that you made, to show that you've given critical time and analysis and thought to something, I think is a very powerful thing for students to see. And as an educator, that's also a very vulnerable and powerful thing to demonstrate for yourself.
Yes.
But it gets kids, I think, and students to look at you and view you as just a human being too, instead of seeing you as somebody in the superior position.
Right.
That can do no wrong. So
right. And it also shows that, you can make mistakes and learn from them, which is what we all want our students to learn, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And that there are lots of teachable moments.
Yes.
All right. So our next question is, what role do you think modern media has on sparking learning about the histories not told? For example, the newest film on the 6888 can open the door to new research inquiries.
Right. I mean, I'll start on that one. I think, honestly, people learn a ton of their history from not academic spaces, or not classrooms, but from magazines, books, video games, manga, movies. And so, as a teacher, I like to take that and then build on. So I often will have students watch movies and then think about how is this framing the issue? What do we learn from the way it's framing the issue? Let's pair it with some primary sources and think about how we could deepen our understanding, or maybe how they simplified things in order for the form of storytelling. So also getting them thinking about genre. Like, you need a main character in a movie, right? But that main character may be the composite of 6 other people who actually lived, right? So they're great, again, great things to get students engaged and to open up conversation, and then to build on to push them further into historical research.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think for uh, one area that I think has been really hard um, to kind of capture in a movie is the whole Jim Crow system, right?
Mhm.
And what it meant to live in a Jim Crow society, right? And the totality, right, of Jim Crow, right, from the cradle to the grave. I don't think people understand that. I still have students who read or would see a movie and run across it, and they were like, I can't believe, I mean, that was like, you're talking about, it's like, yes, Jim Crow was very broad and very vast. And so getting students to understand, right, what it meant to live in the what it meant to live in, the 19th century, but also as students, my upper level and graduate students, what that also means about, if we're thinking about historical silences, right? The silences are there not just because people just didn't want to talk about this topic, but also how people collecting practices, exhibition practices, in that sense, right? Folks are and having one of my classes actually do this local history research. They were like, okay, so that's not at the local archive. And it's like, no, it's not, right? Yeah, right. And so getting students to understand how those, the constructedness of history, right, really, right? And how those silences are created and then perpetuated. Um, it's important.
Can I just add one other thing to that, thinking about films and using them in the classroom? One of the things when I teach films, I talk with students about films that have true invention versus false invention. Like, all films are an invention. Like, every single frame, right, is like saying this place looked like this on this day in 1930. It is all made up. We do not know, right? Unless, even if you're going from a photograph, made up. So a true invention, though, would be where a filmmaker is basing their representation on historical knowledge of the past. False invention would be where they're really not following the historical record. My best example is the film Mississippi Burning, which makes the FBI the hero of the civil rights movement, right? False invention, bleh, terrible, bad history, right? Other films about the civil rights movement have a lot of invention in them, but are true invention. They represent the feeling and the atmosphere and the history of the movement. So that's another way to get students thinking about what we can learn from film and what they offer and what they don't offer.
Our next question asks, if this is not too broad, would either of you suggest 1 or 2 virtual tours? Is there something that comes to mind that teachers can also explore for adding context to the people or places or trends that they're studying, in terms of like a virtual tour or websites that they should visit?
Right. Well, there's the Emmett Till Memory Project, which is a virtual website, virtual website, but a tour of different sites associated with Emmett Till and the murder of Emmett Till and his life and story. That can be a really powerful way to teach about racial violence and to talk about a young person who students can also really relate to as someone who was very young. What's the other? Virtual tours. Mhm. I know, I bet a lot of the civil rights museums have virtual tours. The African American History Museum also has a bunch of resources, right? But yeah.
I would suggest I love to use for um, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, right?
Mhm.
If Gilded Age of Progressive Era. If we're talking about immigration during that period, I love to use their site and their museums because
Mhm.
you get to see various different kinds of different immigrants and from variety of places and the kinds of ways that they came to America or to New York or whatever, and were living during that time. That is, I think that's a pretty decent tour. The other pretty decent tour, again, Gilded Age Progressive Era, is the Lower East Side. I mean, the um, Triangle, Triangle,
Shirtwaist
Fire,
Factory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Waste Factory Fire, right?
Mhm.
And there's this site that was done. It's really old. It's pretty old. Was done by Cornell, right? But it's still very powerful, right? That is something that I also use a lot for students to get them to understand what working conditions were, and the whole notion of workplace safety, right? In this era where in the 20th century, we see at the end of towards the end of the 20th century, this rush to deregulate, but
Mhm.
they get to see why there were
Right.
regulations to begin with,
Yeah.
right? Same with there's no comparable site, but the same with, of course, the banks in the Great Depression and whatever,
Mhm.
banks,
Right.
stock market crash and Great Depression. So again, that whole
Mhm.
notion of change over time, you want to show them what was there, and why did it need to be regulated or changed, and then of course what that means later, right?
Yeah. And the Tenement Museum, just to add very briefly, they have a new tour that features an African American family that tell the history of African Americans in New York. And I think that's a really, um, especially a lot of African American history focuses on the South, and teaching about African Americans who lived in the North, especially pre-Great Migration. There's just not as many resources for doing that. And I think they'll do virtual tours in the classroom. I think they have online resources as well, recorded resources. So it's a great tour. That one.
So,
They also have one, I think, on Asian Americans, I think they added as
Yeah.
well.
Mhm. Yeah, they've really been expanding their interpretation.
We have a robust list of lingering questions, which is incredible. I've never seen a queue of questions like this before. But I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Dr. Romano, Dr. White, would you avail us by answering one or two more questions?
Sure.
yeah.
Great.
I'm trying to pick one that I think would be.
Yeah.
So there was actually one question regarding, I think it was for Dr. White, regarding what she meant about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Hmm.
You kind of skirt over that and circle that did not free Blacks.
Yeah. So people, for various reasons, want to, the Emancipation Proclamation freed African American. I actually take off points. I'm like, you know what? You're gonna lose points for this. If you say this, you get yes. I'm adamant about that because the notion of I want them to understand that it changes the notion of this war as a war against the rebellion, and then makes it a war of emancipation, right? That, yeah, I want them to understand that, right? And so that people are, that all Lincoln is doing is making the enslaved people in these rebelling areas, right, decide to leave. these enslaved people who are also providing the labor for the Confederacy, right? This is all he's doing. He's actually striking at, the folks who are doing the work, and for, Confederate forces that are facing desertion and all kinds of stuff. It was a great strategy, right? But it wasn't about freedom necessarily, right? And so, no, that's what I meant.
Mhm. Yeah. It only frees people in areas they did not control. So like it's absolutely no
right.
authority, right? Did not free anybody in an area that
else's country. How can you free somebody in somebody else's country?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's right. Yeah.
So I'm going to combine this one. There's two specific questions that are kind of very similar. One person was actually asking that, or stating that her school doesn't offer an African American history class, so she's trying to embed these ideas into the larger context of U.S. history. There was also another teacher who said the great challenge of teaching African American history is without trying to make it about slavery and Civil War. So the struggle of balance is really real when approaching U.S. history from one lens. Not trying to approach it from one lens, but through the experience of different races, ethnicity, and women. What would your recommendations be to also keeping them in mind with the standardized testing requirements that hold us to strict pacing guides?
Mm.
And then making sure you're bringing in those multiple perspectives into the teaching of U.S. history.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. It's I so respect what teachers at the secondary level do, because college professors have so much more leeway, like just so much more leeway. But one of the things that a course that I saw that I thought was really, really successful is it kind of picked 4 composite people to follow throughout history. So, for example, we're going to follow, like in each period, right? So there's an African American, an Irish immigrant, woman something, and a whatever. Like, and in each period of history, then kind of like caught up with those people. What would they be doing? What would be happening to them now? And like knowing that they are standing in for a larger group and that they are, not fully representative, but saying that at every moment in history, all of this is happening at the same time. And we can't understand World War II, let's say, as an event, if we don't understand what's happening to African Americans, what's happening to women, how that war is affecting all these different people, the young man who's sent off to war, the woman who finally gets to go, get some freedom, right. Like, so that's one way to do it, by sort of creating some characters who you follow throughout a survey of American history.
That actually is a wonderful way to do that. And I think about, for those folks, you want to think about what, your learning goals and learning outcomes, and what are some of the concepts you're trying to get across, right? Big picture ideas, what you're trying to show, or you want your students to show you. And so I would go through and think about one, using one piece or one person or one situation to show to teach a particular thing. One thing I say to my undergraduates in my US survey is that there's no such thing as everybody. If you're saying everybody did XYZ, no, there is no all or everybody. There are always exceptions to these different things. And so pick one and show how things are different. I use triangle to talk about, not just of course, a lot of folks progressive era are women, right? Talk about suffrage and whatever, but what are the lives of working women like, right? And then working women, and in many cases, immigrant women, right? You get me? And so there are places where you can do that kind of thing, right? If you want to talk about the lives of Native Americans in a particular place, or in places, right? And to not show them as some stagnant group. Where are the places that you want to do that? If you want to talk about, folks who are, Asian American Pacific Islanders, how do you do that, right? If you want to talk about Latin Americans, right? Mexican Americans, there are spaces and places in our history where you can do that. And I think that it requires planning, but you can't, because you can't do everything, you can't do all of it. Can't do all of it. Right.
That's a hard truth to grapple with at the end of trying to provide so many and actually providing so many wonderful resources and reflections and advice on why and how to teach African American history, especially in this moment. We can't do all of it.
Yeah. Cannot.
I want to thank you both so much for lending your time and care and expertise to this conversation. I am so excited to learn and to bask in the reality that this is the first of our 4 webinars. So we have so much more to look forward to in terms of other curriculum specialists and professors and people with experience within the field who can help translate what is happening in academic spaces for what we can bring to our classrooms here and now. So thank you both for doing that. Again, if you are still with us, make sure that you go to the link and complete your survey. This is going to be available for everyone come tomorrow morning. If you can't get enough of this and you have to go back and you want to show parts in your classroom, you want to show parts to a friend, it's going to be available for everyone. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to the participants for your wonderful questions. We're going to take a copy of the questions that are still there, and Jamie and I will do our due diligence to follow up on all of those questions and add any relevant resources to that ongoing resource list that we have for you on Google Classroom. So thank you all, and good night,
Thank you.
and take care.
Thank you.